Okay, so this video, sorry, bear with me. This video is about George Rogers Clark, the frontier hero of the American Revolution. I recommend George Rogers Clark, I Glory in War by William R. Nestor. Not a very big book, 300 pages. We'll say 330. He's a fascinating guy. For anyone who doesn't know, he's the older brother of William Clark, who gets who volunteers for the Lewis and Clark expedition. George Rogers Clark is the founder of Louisville, Kentucky. One of the frontier fighters. He's just somebody who's not really remembered. And I came across this channel, and instantly I fell in love with it because I saw George Rogers Clark. And the channel's called Free History. Greg? It's a new channel. They had like 21 videos. I've been scrolling through and looking at them. I'm definitely going to be doing them. I know that some people won't be watching this. A lot of my subscribers won't watch this because it's American history. I wish you would. I think you'd find it interesting. George Rogers Clark is somebody that is fascinating to me. But let's go ahead and get into this. This is, like I say, it's a new channel. He had 188 subscribers. So if you do like the video, just go subscribe to the channel. You know, help the guy out, because I think that the people that he's been covering, Israel Putnam's on there. Israel Putnam was the guy in charge of like the Marines, and when I think he stepped down and he was replaced by I don't know if you can see that book right there, John Paul Jones. I believe he was Scottish, and as one thing said, he was insane. Great thing for us. So let's go ahead and get into the video. I'm sorry, just check out the channel. I think you'd really like it.
Frontiersman fighting against the elements, Mother Nature, and his fellow man, trekking across the unknown to discover what lies just over the horizon. We often allow ourselves to fall for the tale of the brave explorer, documenting what no man has ever seen before. In doing so, however, we quite conveniently forget that, for the vast majority of human history...
Sorry. Swallow my ice. Lewis and Clark gazing out at the Pacific Ocean alongside Native Americans. So George Rogers Clark would have been the older brother for whichever one was which. And then this would, I'm guessing, was this Sacagawea? Sacagawea? Was that who it was? I don't remember.
Faraway lands and exotic peoples have not been discovered, but rediscovered by explorers from different cultures that are oftentimes considered superior. Columbus was not the first to step foot on Guanahani in the Bahamas, nor were Lewis and Clark the first to gaze upon the vastness of the Pacific from the shores of western North America. But they were the heralds of a new age, an age that would be defined by prosperity, growth, and immeasurable power for some. For others, the coming age would be marked by fire, exploitation, and extermination. So, as we tell the story of the explorer, soldier, and frontiersman George Rogers Clark, let us remember not just the cost of bringing civilization to new lands, but specifically remember those who bore the cost. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history.
I just want to say, okay, William Clark. I just want to say, George Rogers Clark, for people who don't know, underneath him at one point was Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone looked up to Clark and thought he was an awesome guy. Like, he was a savage in terms of fighting, just military stuff. So if you like Daniel Boone and you kind of think, well, Daniel Boone was pretty cool, this is who he looked up to.
George Rogers Clark was born in Albemarle County, Virginia, to John and Ann Rogers Clark on November 19, 1752. George was the second of 10 children to the couple. 4 of his 5 brothers would serve as officers in the American Revolution. His youngest brother, William Clark, would give his namesake to the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition after the war. About 4 years after George was born, his family moved to the fringes of the civilized world after his father inherited a 400-acre plantation from his uncle on the Virginian frontier. Despite not having a formal education, George was tutored extensively at home, and he excelled in mathematics. Capturing his grandson's aptitude for math, John Rogers trained the boy as a land surveyor, enabling him to embark on a surveying trip to Western Virginia at the age of 19. Although settling beyond the Allegheny Mountains was forbidden by British law, the reality was quite different. Thousands of settlers flooded into the Ohio River Valley and along the Kanawha. For the next few years, George surveyed the Kanawha River region, finding good land for himself, his family, and his friends, while acting as an impromptu guide for groups of prospectors. He also spent much time among the Native Americans of the area, learning many of their customs. In 1774, George got his first taste of military service, becoming a captain in the Virginia militia during Lord Dunmore's War. Though we lack particulars about his service, George Rogers Clark likely got his first taste of battle at Point Pleasant. As the American Revolution began, Kentucky was stuck in limbo. A land speculator, Richard Henderson, claimed he had bought Kentucky from the Cherokee. The inhabitants of Kentucky refused to recognize Henderson's claim. Instead, they dispatched 24-year-old George and another man, John Gabriel Jones, to petition the Virginia General Assembly to annex Kentucky. The 2-person delegation was successful. Governor Patrick Henry, yes, that one, declared Kentucky a county in Virginia. To help their new citizens defend themselves, Governor Henry granted Clark 500 pounds of gunpowder. 1777 would be known as Bloody 77 to the settlers. The British governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs at Fort Detroit, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton, began supplying the Native Americans in the region with arms and munitions to harass the settlers, take prisoners, and burn crops. Clark spent the year going from settlement to settlement with a small group of men, vainly trying to protect crops from roving bands of Indian warriors. The Kentuckians were on their own. Neither the Continental Army nor the Virginia militia would be coming. Clark, who had been informed of Hamilton's strategy by 2 spies, devised a daring plan to destroy the British outposts in the Illinois country. In December 1777, he was permitted by Governor Henry to carry out the expedition. He was formally commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia and given the authorization to raise troops. Given the ferocity of these Indian raids in the area, recruitment was difficult. Clark and his officers had to gather volunteers from as far away as North Carolina. The unit, which only numbered about 150 frontiersmen and 20 settlers and their families, finally set out from their muster point at Redstone on May 12, 1778. By July 1778, the small band had built a supply base at Corn Island near the Falls of Ohio and were ready to set out. On June 26, 1778, 175 men left for the Franco-Indian town of Kaskaskia, which they captured on July 4th without firing a shot. The next day, Clark's subordinate, Captain Bowman, pacified the settlements of Cahokia, Prairie, de Roucher, and St. Philip. While
I want to real quick talk about the Kaskaskia. He captured Fort Kaskaskia before the shot was fired. So when I went to Fort Sackville, which is the George Rogers Clark monument now, which was dedicated by FDR in 1936, maybe. It's in Vincennes, Indiana. Vincennes, Indiana, really cool town. Not big. It's got William Henry Harrison's governor's mansion there. Some Civil War battles, stuff like that. Anyways, Fort Kaskaskia was controlled by the British. All around there was, like, you call it a town, village, whatever you want, but it was Native Americans, French settlers, fur trappers, I'm sorry. There were some Spanish there. I don't remember if there was Portuguese. There were British, Americans who had just moved out. And all of them were just intertwined together, and they were living in peace. Everyone was working together. It was a community, And the British had the fort, and the British were kind of trading with them, but it was along the Mississippi River, which was a very important highway, water highway. And Clark needed to get to Kaskaskia. The war had started. He needed to get to Kaskaskia before he thought the British at that fort would have been notified. Whether they were ever notified, I don't think we know. So what he did was he put spies in the town. No one had heard anything about the start of the war. So if the British knew, they were keeping it quiet because, the war was way on the East Coast, and look where they are. They're so far away, probably 1,000 miles away. What are they? Who cares? We're going to keep the peace by just not acknowledging the war, And he snuck in, took the fort without firing a shot, as said, and immediately marched those British soldiers to Detroit and to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. Now, if you get a chance, you should go there. It's really cool little setup. Original capital of Virginia. Side note. So as soon as he takes over Kaskaskia, he turns the cannons on the town. Open fire. He's firing over. He's got people in there that are luring everyone together into safe areas. Let me raise this up, sorry. Luring everyone into safe areas. And so they're hitting all these other things, kind of destroying the town, but making sure they don't kill anyone or hurt anyone, unbeknownst to the town people who didn't know that. They just thought the British was firing on them. All of a sudden, it stops. Several musket fires are going into the air, hooting and hollering, and then George Rogers Clark comes running into town with his musket, and the rest of the people in town are like, what is going on? What's happening here? He shows up. There's a war between the British and the colonists. It's a war for independence. The British here found out about it. They wanted to kill all of you. I saved your life. Who here will help me beat the British? You've just heard that. You're in a town that was just open fired on by the British because you don't know. You feel you owe this man your life. This man saved you. Who wouldn't volunteer for that? I'll follow that man. He saved my life. Had they known, they probably wouldn't have. But he was a brilliant mental tactician. Make them think it was the British, then they'll fight with us against the British. Not all of them did, but a big chunk of them did. And his siege of Kaskaskia was just, you're lucky that no one got killed, which you would have to think, if you're inside that town, you would think, the British have to know where we could hide. And yet, you know, Ted's home over here didn't get struck. Dave's home didn't get struck. Man, they must have been drunk, firing those cannons all over the place. They missed most of the stuff. So I don't know what it was all about. Oh, look, this guy saved our life. Maybe that's what it was about. It's pretty brilliant.
Clark and his men held up in Kaskaskia for the next few months. Father Guibault, the local priest, journeyed to the Vincennes to gather the local population's support. He was successful, and the town pledged their allegiance to Clark.
Yeah.
Now, you might reasonably ask how Clark and his small expedition of 175 men accomplished all of this without any resistance. Despite the British receiving lofty promises from the local outposts, the predominantly French settlements, who had just received news of the Franco-American alliance, were all too happy to bend the knee to Clark after he promised them all of the privileges of American citizenship. Many of the Native Americans in the area were also wary of going to war with Clark. By this time, Clark had already developed a fearsome reputation as a warrior and leader. He was an imposing 6-foot-tall man who had learned much from his time among the Native Americans in the Kanawha Valley. He sent each tribe a red and white wampum, a type of Native American belt. This was his ultimatum: peace or war. Few tribes wanted outright war. Most accepted peace and remained neutral.
Most didn't want war with him because he would go into battle with the thought and the idea that not only are we going to kill all of you, we're going to, I think he said it at one time, not only are we going to kill all the warriors, we're going to catch all the remaining women and children, and I'm just going to feed them to the dogs. You're a warrior. You're going to fight this guy who you know, he's one of the rare people, like Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson said, "I want to kill you," you believed it because he meant it. When George Rogers Clark said, "I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to feed your wife to my dogs," you were like, cool. When is this going to happen? Tomorrow. All right. Well, we won't be here. And that was it. And if you stuck around, it wasn't good.
Clark made it quite clear what would happen if the nations chose war. This is the last speech you may ever expect from the big...
Clark may have been a good military commander. He was also brutal, as we'll soon see. I just muted my mic, sorry.
Knives. The next thing will be the tomahawk. And you may expect in 4 moons to see your women and children given to the dogs to eat, while those nations that have kept their word with me will flourish and grow like the willow tree on the river banks, under the care and nourishment of their father, the Big Knives. It is no surprise, then, that while his fellow Americans saw him as the Washington of the West, his enemies often referred to him as the cannibal of the West. Governor Hamilton was alerted to Clark's expedition by a Spanish trader who had left Vincennes shortly after the American occupation. Hamilton didn't wait for orders of reinforcements. He assembled a small force and, on December 17th, quickly recaptured Vincennes, fortifying the adjacent Fort Sackville, and began preparing a spring campaign that would easily recapture the lost territory. Clark, a natural tactician, understood that if Hamilton could hold out until spring and gather his forces, then this country and also Kentucky is lost. So he developed a bold, perhaps foolhardy plan to march 240 miles through the depth of winter and recapture the position before Hamilton was reinforced. Clark himself confided to Bowman that this mission was likely a one-way trip. The march was hell. Although the winter wasn't especially cold, it was still winter. It rained constantly. Supplies ran out. The men struggled through shoulder-high water from the flooded Embarrass River for 4 days. Despite the odds, the men dragged themselves to Vincennes, arriving on February 23rd. Clark and his ragtag force had remained undetected, and the French population did not resist the Americans as they re-entered the city and besieged Fort Sackville. While Hamilton and Clark attempted to negotiate terms of surrender, Clark, in an attempt to terrify the British and sow dissension between them and their Indian allies, ordered the execution of 5 captured Indians in plain sight of the fort's battlements.
So, I didn't know if they were going to talk about that. So, on their way to Fort Sackville, they said it's winter, Indiana, Illinois, it's cold, snowy, but it had rained a lot instead of accumulating snow. And the river area they were going through, it was like a flooded area. Oh, I think they said like 5 miles, but it was just really wet, swampy almost, which it's not really. And so they had to trek through all of this, and then at night, so they couldn't tip the enemy off, they couldn't have a fire. No fire. You've just been trudging through water, swampy conditions. You can't have a fire. 4 days. They finally get there. Just before they were close, they captured 5 of the natives, the British allies. The rest of the natives were inside the fort with the British. These natives were hunting. So he captures them. Unbeknownst to him, one of the captures was the chief. So he gets in a good distance, tells the British, surrender the fort. British are like, no. So he lines up these 5, pulls out a tomahawk. The natives inside start to sing this death song. The natives that he's got lined up start singing it too. They're crying back and forth. They're singing it, and this is the song that they would sing upon dying or whatever, and everyone's singing it. Kind of, I guess, how we might, you'd hear people doing prayer and stuff like that. So he's talking away, surrender the fort. They say no. He tomahawks one right to the skull, kills him. No, hits the other one. No, hits the third. No, hits the fourth. And he's yelling back and forth the whole time, telling them to surrender the fort. And the British are kind of like, nah. The natives are losing their mind inside. Save them. Surrender the fort. We don't have a hope. Surrender the fort. Save our people. And the British are kind of like, Gets to the last one. They won't surrender. Hits him in the head with a tomahawk. Then he starts yelling and screaming at them, I'm going to kill the rest of you, and da-da-da. Then he gets tapped on his thigh. He looks down, and it was the native. It was the chief. He hit him with the tomahawk. Didn't kill him. The guy pulls it out of his head, wipes his blood off on like his, I don't know what you'd call the native outfit, on the sleeve of his like coat, whatever it was, raw hide coat or whatever. Wipes the blood off, grabs the axe handle or the blade, and then taps him on the leg with the handle. Clark realizes that, grabs it, and then has to hit him several more times, and I don't even think that killed him. But after all of that, the natives inside start crying. The British then had them all arrested inside. Didn't want them to leave, couldn't risk it. The British then thought about it overnight, and the next morning decided, all right, fine, we'll surrender the fort. And now I'm not bashing the British for this. Switch roles, I wouldn't doubt the Americans would have done the same thing. Only because it wasn't Americans and it wasn't British who were being killed. It was natives. It was people that they brought on to help. So it doesn't mean as much. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to downplay the death of 5 people, but it doesn't mean as much because, well, that's our allies. It's not us. And I'm sure Americans would have done the same thing. Or colonists. Did I just say that? Colonists. So yeah, that was That was the big thing on Fort Sackville. He went with 180 people. Side note, 180 people. He told his second in command to go to the very back. If anyone gets even with you or a step behind, shoot him. No deserters. No half-steppers with this. And every one of them made it, and no one was sick or anything. And they went on to do that.
Hamilton unconditionally surrendered the fort on February 25th at 10 a.m., effectively ceding British control of the Ohio River Valley to Clark. More specifically, control was ceded to Virginia, which quickly claimed the area as Illinois County. Despite the victory being celebrated across the new nation, including by George Washington himself, Clark spent the rest of the war dreaming about launching an assault on Fort Detroit. Unfortunately for him, the supplies, funds, and men never materialized. For the rest of the war, Clark was content to protect the frontier from combined British Indian raiders and launch retaliatory assaults. He fought, for example, the Battle of Pequot against a Shawnee-led Native American coalition that culminated in significant loss of life on both sides, the destruction of the village, and the burning of crops. For his efforts earlier in the war and at the Battle of Pequot, he was promoted to Brigadier General by Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson. Clark spent the following 2 years conducting the same tit-for-tat combat against Native Americans. Clark, who was enraged that several nations refused to, quote, grow like the willow trees on the riverbanks under the care and nourishment of their father, the Big Knives, began believing instead that it was necessary to demonstrate that we are always able to crush the Native Americans at our pleasure. Shortly after the Treaty of Paris, Clark was appointed principal surveyor of bounty lands to try and help the thousands of settlers that poured into the recently conquered territory. He also attempted to forge peace with nations in the area, signing both the Treaty of Fort McIntosh and the Treaty of Fort Finney, but peace was not to last. Assuming command of a 1,200-man-strong force, Clark began raiding Native American villages along the Wabash River by the end of 1786.
It's actually called the Wabash, not the Wabash.
This campaign, one of the first battles in the Northwest Indian War, was inconclusive. While on campaign, his reputation was greatly diminished by accusations of alcoholism. After his expedition ended, Clark left Kentucky and moved to the Indiana frontier. Clark could never repay the massive debts he had accumulated waging war in Kentucky. Virginia and the federal government refused to compensate him for his fraudulent purchases. He briefly tried to serve as a soldier for hire, being commissioned as a major general in the armies of France and commander-in-chief of the French Revolutionary Legion on the Mississippi River by Edmond Charles Genet, the French envoy to the new United States. Although nothing ever came of these machinations, Clark, who had spent the last of his wealth on procuring supplies to seize Louisiana from the Spanish, was left both disgraced and in heavy debt. Debt collectors hounded him for the rest of his life. After losing his job for the Indiana Canal Company in 1806, after his fellow board member, Vice President Aaron Burr, was arrested for treason, Clark returned to Kentucky. He built a small 2-room cabin where he lived with his 2 slaves. To make ends meet, he and his slaves ran a small mill. That was until 1809. That year, Clark suffered a stroke. He fell into a burning fireplace and severely burned his right leg. The leg had to be amputated above the knee, which ended his ability to live independently. Having never married and unable to live alone, Clark moved in with his sister Lucy and her husband, William Croghan, on their estate near Louisville. In recognition of his services, the Virginia General Assembly granted Clark a $400 pension in 1812. Despite being happy that he finally received official recognition from Virginia for his services, his health was in steep decline. George Rogers Clark died after another stroke on February 13th, 1818, at the age of 65. He was interred at the Locust Grove Cemetery 2 days later. During his funeral, Judge John Rowan concluded his funeral oration by saying, "The mighty oak of the forest has fallen, and now the scrub oaks sprout all around." Since his death, several counties, cities, and institutions across the United States bear his name. February 25th is celebrated in Indiana as George Rogers Clark Day. As a military man, he was certainly no strategic mastermind. Still, he was a bold, daring, and impetuous commander who led his men to success against nearly insurmountable odds in the harsh Indiana wilderness. As a frontiersman, he was undoubtedly a trailblazer who opened up modern-day Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana to a flood of American settlers. Without his actions before, during, and after the American Revolution, it's uncertain when the United States would have come to control that land, if ever. At the same time, however, we must remember that one man's hero is often another man's villain. While he may have earned the respect of his friends and foes, one does not earn the nickname cannibal for nothing.
That statue that you just saw, let me go back to it. So that the monument that you saw going up those stairs, this is what you see that's inside that monument. It's really nice. I walked in, I was the only one inside, and there was a woman standing in there with a little tracker, and I walked in and I looked at her, and she just picked up the thing and then put it back down, just to let them know that one more person had come in, and at the end of the day they keep track. It was free to go in there, but there really isn't anything else in there. It's just a picture of him and then all those paintings, and you look up at the ceiling, and it's pretty nice. I wasn't sure, since I did this video, if they would do this. So on my trip, here's the monument at a distance, and this is the Abraham Lincoln Bridge. This is where Abraham Lincoln, this is where Abraham Lincoln crossed from Indiana into Illinois. So, but that's obviously that at a distance. And then this is the site of Fort Sackville, captured from the British by George Rogers Clark and his heroic comrades, February 25th, 1779. And now, before I show you the last, before I show you the last picture, which is this, you saw this is the front steps, and then that's the way in, or it's actually on the other side. You can walk all the way around this whole monument, and it signifies where the fort was, and I think it's even on this grass and stuff. But the day that I went there, which was November 16th, 2019, and I know that because it was just before my birthday, they had the basement opened up, and FDR had dedicated this monument. Well, in the basement, I only have one picture, and it's not great, and I do apologize for that. It's a fallout shelter. It's a big bunker. There's a ghost woman over here. All right, it was a real woman. But yeah, the whole thing is just underneath. It's just this giant bunker. And they were like, yeah, you can go through and take pictures if you want. I was like, all right. And I only took the one, because every single time I was holding my camera up like I was going to take a picture, they had a person there that was just looking over at me, and I just felt like, I don't want them to think I'm a terrorist just eyeballing this stuff. So I didn't take a lot of pictures. But since we're talking about Vincennes, which, we're not, but we are, this is the governor's mansion of William Henry Harrison. That's the front, and there's a light that goes through there. And Fort Sackville would be 1 mile this way, and the fort and the governor's mansion had lights, and it was basically just like a torch fire, and they would put it on this thing, and they could see it. And so if they turned on a light here, a fire here, went to the fort could gather people and then charge over in about 15 minutes. And that just let them know that there were natives all around this house trying to shoot their way in. And let me tell you, these walls are 2-foot thick brick cinder block walls. These windows are, oh my goodness, they're double pane, super thick. These shutters on the outside were like 18 inches, and then the shutters on the inside were 12 inches. The interior walls are, I think those are also 18 inches. So they could shut these shutters and lock everything up, and it was almost impenetrable by a musket ball. So, and then they could go down there and shoot up. They could go out there and shoot down. Yeah, it was an impressive sight. Since we're talking about natives, one of the things about William Henry Harrison, again, this is George Rogers Clark, but in Vincennes, Indiana, right by Fort Sackville, you can see this. Tecumseh and Harrison. Here, Shawnee warrior Tecumseh met with. I'm sorry, I'm in the way. Can I shrink this a little bit and see what happens? I think it is met. Yes. Met with Indian Territory Governor William Henry Harrison in August 1810 and July 1811. Tecumseh spoke for a growing a growing confederacy of American Indians led by his brother, the prophet, that guy. He denounced 1809 treaty at Fort Wayne, in which U.S. government continued policy of taking Indian lands by the treaty. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. More stuff. Henry Harrison was just telling him, don't get involved. This is the War of 1812. This is after. Don't get involved. But he eventually did, and then he was killed at the Battle of Tippecanoe. But this is the Tulip Grove where they supposedly met. It's not true. The Tulip Grove is actually over here, but it's been paved over. And then here's a nice image of it. But I don't remember where that light was. Maybe it was in here. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. That was my sharing. The William Henry Harrison stuff was just extra. It's just because it was down the street. It was a mile away. So I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. Go visit Free History, their channel. And I'm going to do a couple of their videos because I like the fact that he covers people that don't get attention or don't get the attention that maybe they should. And I think that's awesome. So, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Have a good night.